Hello everyone! Welcome to IST Brown Bag session. My name is Kate Hilario, one of the members of the digital team, and I'm honored to be your host today. Before we get started, may I know if anyone can hear me well? Please let me know through the chat box. Thank you for letting me know. We are elated that you came to join with us today. We hope that everyone is excited to learn more for our today's session, Virtual Teams and Remote Work, How to Succeed from Anywhere. And just some reminders before we officially start. Please work in an environment where background noises can be muffled at the very least. Please use the chat box if you have any concerns during the webinar. During the Q&A portion, please type your question in the Q&A window if you have any questions. Be attentive and avoid distractions. And if you're facing any technical difficulties with Zoom, please log out and log back in again. Now, I would like to introduce to you all our speaker for today. He is a program director and department chair of the Information Science and Technology. Please welcome Mr. Cyrus Buenafe.
Hi, good morning to everybody attending this particular brown bag right now. And I have should we say, the burden to bore you. Well, I hope not, for the next hour or so. And the title for today's session is aptly called Virtual Teams and Remote Work: How to Succeed from Anywhere. Um, well, typical of a true brown bag, so I will be sharing a little bit of a lecture, maybe for the first 40 minutes, and then throughout the remainder of the hour, I will entertain questions. But if you have any concerns right away, please make use of the Q&A box below. Type in your questions as soon as you can, and then later on in the Q&A session, we'll go through them one by one. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just go ahead and start a presentation on remote work, okay, and virtual teams. So it's quite interesting because, this is not going to be just another presentation, right? By this time, after more than a year in our current situation, I'm sure you see me right now. I'm not currently in the office. I'm at home working. There are so many ideas, thoughts, best practices about working from home or about working from any other place outside of the office. So I'm trying to position this particular brown bag not as another presentation. More recently, some of the more popular authors like Alexandra Samuel talked a bit about remote work and how to actually draw maximum value from the current situation right now. So I don't intend to compete or maybe just to augment perhaps what these people are saying. But the intention of this particular brown bag is to perhaps highlight one particular author, and that would be Sedal Neely. So she is actually a professor in Harvard Business School, and she was the one who actually wrote a 2021 book entitled Remote Work Revolution. Okay, succeeding from anywhere. It's very new. If you have access to fully book right now, you can actually get a copy of this. It's not a very long book. It's quite convenient to read. I wouldn't say it's an easy read. If your staple perhaps is fiction, then this is probably something different for you. But if you've been reading nonfiction books, okay, I mean you'll probably go through the material very quickly. It's not that difficult to read. And in that book, or in this particular book on remote work revolution, okay, Sadal Neely actually talked about 8 particular areas, 8 questions that perhaps you and I have regarding remote work or how we actually get to do remote work. Now, for this particular brown bag, however, I'll just focus on 3 particular questions. Okay. And the reason why I choose three out of the eight is, well, I feel these three questions are perhaps what's burning right now with respect to our audience right now from UANP and from our extension program partners right now. At the same time, these are three areas wherein I feel the department would have something to say about. Okay, pretty much this is our field. This is something that we can help contribute. And towards the end of my particular presentation, I will share with you along the way. I mean, some cases on how we've actually been able to exercise in each of these particular areas, in these three areas, specifically. So these are the three questions that I will discuss today. So how can we launch or relaunch to thrive in remote work? How can I trust colleagues I barely see in person? And how should I use digital tools in remote work? And in fact, we're going to talk about alignment. We're going to talk about building trust, okay, within teams. And the latter part of this presentation will talk about using the right digital tools. So these are three things. Now, take note that by going through these three things, this doesn't automatically mean that you will completely succeed 100%. But definitely, if you take to heart the tips, the lessons learned from these three areas, I can assure you that you will be much better than most people who are struggling precisely in these same three areas. So that's going to be my commitment for you at the end of this brown bag, at the end of this presentation. You do these three areas very well, you stand better than most right now. Okay. Now let's start with alignment. It's quite funny because alignment is something that, how do we say this? Alignment is something that we take for granted. In fact, the need to make alignment is something that is built in project management principles. Uh, the most underrated event in every project is the kickoff. Sometimes we even think, well, why do we need to do a kickoff? It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. Well, even in pre-pandemic days, there are benefits. There are reasons why we should be doing a kickoff. More so now when we find ourselves in remote work situations. That alignment through kickoffs, okay, and the like is going to be very critical to ensure that you will be successful precisely in your remote work situation. And the very first thing that you want to do and to think about and to ask yourselves within the office, within your teams, is setting the compass. You want to set that compass. You want to be able to set that direction. You'll probably tell me, well, Chippy, that's pretty obvious, right? But hey, sometimes the more obvious items are the ones that we tend to forget, the ones that we take for granted. And it's a good reminder for us, especially now, especially as we're ending for most of us our school year and as we're going to prepare for the next school year in a few weeks' time. It's good to remind ourselves that we set the compass and we be deliberate about it. This is not like an intellectual private exercise. We have to set the compass within the organization. And by setting the compass, I think it's not just setting the compass individually, but more of getting together, getting everybody to collaborate and contribute in setting that compass and coming up with what we call as shared goals, okay, or a shared understanding of our goals. Sometimes, okay, we set our compass, and for those of us who are used to doing performance management reviews, we get to do that in an individual basis. Okay, but having that shared goal across the employees, okay, within that organization, that's rarely talked about. And that's rarely talked about even in the context of a pre-pandemic situation, okay? Wherein you have offices, it's easy for you to bump into one another and, share a little bit of what it is that you're doing. And then, mentally you can make the connection on what this person is doing with what you're doing, okay? And how it all rolls up to the ultimate objectives of the organization. In a remote work situation, that's even tougher. And which is why it's more important to bring out that idea that, hey, we need to get together. We need to have a good shared understanding of those goals. And the thing about shared goals is that this is not the leader or one person sharing, so to speak, their goals to everybody else. It's an even bolder point here that we need to share goals with one another, that each one would actually contribute actively to this idea of shared goals. Okay? And aside from setting the compass, okay, one way to enforce alignment is that we really need to talk about how to work together, being explicit about it. And this is talking about team norms, right? Being clear on what is acceptable behavior, being clear on what is not acceptable behavior, being clear with what's tolerated, okay? And these team norms are even more important because team norms in a pre-pandemic situation, especially in the office, these are things that you can absorb through osmosis. You just observe in the office, you know more or less where this particular jar goes into the pantry, or you know who gets to sit in this particular chair in the lounge, right? Or you know where you'd go and get your food, okay, for within the cafeteria. So these are the things that you get to see and absorb in a pre-pandemic situation because you have the non-verbal cues to pick up, and then you can really get that understanding that okay, there's that norm, okay, that there's this certain prevailing culture that you need to be respectful of. But in a remote work situation, that's not the case. Okay, I mean, you're not going to immediately pick that up. That okay, you're expecting that everybody needs to email within 24 hours, or you need somebody who can be receiving calls at a particular time of the day. Okay, and it's good that we establish those norms, those interaction norms explicitly. Now there are many things that you'd want to establish, but here are three ideas or three things that you really want to properly establish when you're doing your team norms in a remote work situation. Well, first of all, you want to have an understanding of what's accepted ongoing communication practices. Like if you have meetings, what would be the rules for the meetings? Would you want to do it at this particular day? You want to do this at this particular day of the week, this particular time? What method to use? What's the typical agenda? Who's going to do this, do that? Okay. So there should be norms about ongoing communication. The second idea is uh, establishing norms regarding psychological safety. Okay. It, what's difficult right now is in a remote work situation, and most of us since last year would be struggling maybe to adjust to such a new environment. We run the risk of making mistakes. Now, psychological safety is that property of an organization wherein people would feel safe about making unintentional mistakes or non-malicious mistakes because, well, number one, we accept the fact that everyone is is prone to mistakes, especially in a new situation like the situation we find ourselves in right now. But more than that, psychological safety ensures that learning can happen because learning can only happen if your organization, if your environment is psychologically safe. Okay. Imagine an organization that is so pressured, so stressed up, that you always have to be concerned about the little mistakes that you do. And when you do those little mistakes, you're 100% sure that somebody's going to criticize you, somebody's going to barrage you with a lot of comments, okay, a lot of negative feedback. Okay, that is a situation of a low psychological safety. And for sure, you're not going to learn much from that. Even if the content of the feedback is valid, is perhaps truthful, the learning change that's to be expected will not happen because there's no psychological safety to begin with. Yeah, you learn about it, but you're always going to have that threat that if I still make that mistake now and it's probably not my fault, then you're probably going to be discouraged and never going to want to learn anyway. Okay. And lastly, the last aspect about team norms that is a good suggestion would be making sure that no member feels isolated. Okay. One of the things that the department took note was making sure that we have this principle of non discrimination. we don't want to have anyone feel isolated. Okay. And with the remote work nowadays, professional isolation is a thing. Okay. You don't get to see anyone, especially if you've been used to that uh, environment where you go to the office, you see everyone, you get to do some water cooler conversations, chit chat here and there. And then that helps in creating bonds. We'll talk more about that in building trust. But the idea there is that because you don't have that natural, organic way of building connections with one another in a remote setup, then you need to be very deliberate, very active in establishing these connections. Okay. Later on, we'll talk about the tools on how you can actually support that. But it's good for us to remind ourselves that in tandem with psychological safety, you need to ensure that no member feels isolated. And this is also true for students. We want to make sure that students don't feel isolated. Okay. Uh, Perhaps as most of us were growing up when we were doing schooling many years ago, um, we don't really feel isolated because in between classes, we go with friends, we go with some of our classmates, we go out through the corridors to our usual hangout places. Okay. And we feel connected with the school, with the institution. But now all of your students are stuck at home, depending on the current prevailing local regulations. You still don't have that ability to really connect with fellow classmates. Okay, so it's that idea as well that we want to make sure also that no student is also feeling isolated in any classroom situation. Now, the third practice that we want to ensure when we think about alignment is, well, being realistic. Okay, knowing the realities of our situation and filling the roles, making sure that we have the right people doing the right jobs in place. Okay, it's not being naive or it's not being in a ivory tower. We're in okay, you know. Thinking that certain things will not happen anymore or these things will eventually pass tomorrow or next week, but really having that down to earth understanding that okay, this is the reality we're faced with. Okay, and we need people to respond to this reality. So this particular tip forces us to actually understand and know each one's contributions and each one's constraints. Okay. And we have to be honest about that. We need to have a shared understanding of what everyone can do, whether it be colleagues at work, whether it be also students in our offices, sorry, in our classrooms. We want to make sure that that is something that that's clear. Okay, that we also know their constraints. We also know what limits them from doing certain things, or under what conditions won't they be able to do these things as well. So these are the some of the key realities that we also want to keep in mind. Okay, when we're doing alignment, the individual contributions and the individual constraints of your colleagues and even your stakeholders. Okay, like the students. Another aspect on alignment is, well, making sure you find the resources you need. Now it's easier said than done, granted, but I think now is a good opportunity for us to, you know, perhaps be bold in making assertions on the resources that you really need, right? Of course, some of the requests might be deferred because of financial considerations. That's fine. But I would even argue that in moments wherein things are really difficult, we see the creativity and the ingenuity of people emerge from such situations, that the resources that you will eventually need, it will come to you. But of course, we don't want to force ourselves in a situation wherein, okay, we need to put ourselves, find ourselves backed against the wall and then forcing ourselves to be creative, right? I mean, if there is an ordinary opportunity for us to fill in those resources, then why not? let's go ahead and let's find the resources that we really need now. Um, and lastly, for us leaders, we have to ensure that we have to be committed. We have to know that more than anything else, we stay committed. Okay, we guide everyone towards that, and for us to be able to show that commitment, it's all about doing launching and relaunching. Okay, we have to find a way to, of course, establish things again. We have to launch. Okay, we have to do a kickoff. But then along the way, let's say within a calendar year or within the school year, we do relaunches. There would be good natural pit stops in between. We're in, okay, at this point, let's do a relaunch. Let's do a review of what we've mentioned at the launch, see where we are, and then, do a little bit of tweaking. And then we reestablish everything again. We remind people again of our shared goals, our shared norms, our a shared understanding of contributions and constraints, okay, and relaunch again. Okay. And it's quite important that we have that discipline in reestablishing or realigning again, um, and and that takes effort. And some of you might even say, Chippy, that's probably going to take too much time. Well, it does. But let me argue that the little time that you will have to spend in addition to the normal things that you've been doing is probably going to be worth it in terms of productivity, in terms of success. Okay. And what you don't really need to spend like a full week or a full month doing your launch and relaunch. But the bottom line there is that uh, if you really want to be committed to the success of your organization, then we have to keep in mind these simple suggestions, simple practices on alignment. Okay, and we hope that by doing this, you can really establish the rhythm, the pace that everybody will rally behind you. Okay, in that respect. Now, the second question. Okay, the second topic that we're going to talk about is on building trust. Now, this is quite important, especially in a situation where in building trust naturally is not available to us, like being in the office, being able to talk to one another, okay, and along the way we build trust. Okay. In a remote work setup, that's not possible, and yet we know trust is important in order for us to be successful because, as I've said a while ago, trust is like your fuel, is like the basic material for you to be able to make sure that people are not isolated. Okay. And with a high level of trust, I mean, people would feel confident. People would know that they're part of a group because they're trusted. Right? I mean, we hear that because I trust you, because I have faith in you. Okay, I feel secure. I feel that nothing's gonna go wrong. Right? We have that we have that feeling at times, but it's important. It's important, especially now in the current remote work situation, that trust has to be established. The trust has to be developed actively. Okay. Now we have to understand, even in pre-pandemic days, trust is not evenly distributed. I mean, some people trust person X more than the other person, right? And even within a team, even within an organization, sometimes people tend to be more trustworthy than the others. It doesn't mean that the others are like lousy or they have criminal tendencies. No, none of that sort, right? But we have to accept the fact that trust is not evenly distributed. Okay? You can look at that as a spectrum or as a scale, but definitely it's not going to be equivalent for all the time. Okay? And it is possible for us to increase our trust, to establish that trust through credible, repeated interactions. Okay, trust is not a one-off activity wherein we do this activity, boom, we elevated our trust from 0 to 100%. Okay, or with this one-off activity that we can probably, be willing to risk our lives for people. Okay, or you're going to put your life on the line for this particular colleague. Well, that's not going to happen. Okay, there could be some cases, very very exceptional, but normally that's not possible. Okay, and the only way for us to increase that trust is through credible, repeated interactions. It's funny, right? It's like a tautology wherein credibility, the root of credibility, credo, belief, implies that the interaction itself is trustworthy, right? So, uh, but more than that, it's also the frequency. You need to interact with these people every so often. With the remote work setup, we don't have that elevated number of frequency of interactions. It's I'm sure you've experienced it. It has been diminished over the last few months. You know, and especially with newer employees coming in during the pandemic, it's even tougher for those newer employees to build trust, right? And for the incumbents, relative to that new employee, it's also difficult for us to establish a trust with that new employee because we don't have those organic situations during the pre-pandemic days that would allow us to build that trust naturally. And yet we know that's important. So what do we do? How do we go through that? Well, first of all, let's understand that trust can be broken down intellectually or conceptually into different categories. So the first one is that there is such a thing as a swift trust, but there is such a thing as passable trust. Swift trust, you need to elevate from 0 to 100 in a very, very short period of time. Okay? And what are circumstances wherein swift trust is expected or necessary? Well, in the case of emergencies, if you've been asked to form an ad hoc team to respond to an emergency, well, you need to trust each other because lives are on the line. We see that in doctors, we see that in emergency personnel, firefighters, policemen. Sometimes they're probably looking at that person for the very first time. They've been banded together because they need to solve a problem very quickly. So there's no way for you to say, well, why don't we do a team building first before we address this fire in front of us? Well, yeah, I don't think firefighters will do team buildings then and there. We just have to trust, okay, whether you're new or somebody I've worked with in the past, I have to trust you regardless. And I have to trust you very quickly. Okay. But for most parts, we have passable trust. Okay, we trust people at the bare minimum, right? We trust them because we cannot find any objections to not trusting them, or to trusting them, right? Um, well, we have to trust them. I mean, it's passable. Okay, I mean, it's not something that you'd put your life on the line for this guy. Okay, but I mean, for things that are something that you can triangulate perhaps through other means, you'd probably believe the person off the bat. Okay? You're not going to feel concerned about, oh, is this person trustworthy? You're not going to ask that all the time, right? Um, okay, there's that minimum trust. And sometimes passable trust happens in formal situations wherein, okay, if you're part of a team, well, you necessarily have to trust this person at a passable level, right? But but of course that trust has to be built over time. Okay, and it should build over time. But when you're new to a team, let's say you're a new employee in an organization, well, you trust that person immediately because that person would have hurdled the minimum requirements for employability, right? So you trust that person. You know that the person is minimally competent, and that's fine. Of course, you'll have opportunities along the way to test that. Okay, if that person passes the test, then your trust increases over time. But bottom line, everybody starts with some passable trust. Okay, and it's really low. Okay, if you think of it as a curve or as a graph, your swift trust would have a steep curve at the start, but then it plateaus at the top. Okay, because there's nothing more above it, right? If you've already given your full trust to that person, that's swift trust. In passable trust, well, it's a very flat, gradual rise, but you can look at it over more and more interactions with that person. That the rate of increase in that trust is actually also increasing. So eventually, after a period of time, the level of swift trust will be the trust that would be the same level as the trust that came through passable trust, right? Um, But more than the swift and the passable trust, I think what's also important for us to take note is that there is such a thing as cognitive trust. We intellectually can trust this person. And normally this is based on competency, based on qualification. You can trust this person is good because of his reputation, because of his resume. I mean, you can see that, right? You can trust that person cognitively, right? But more than that, and this is at the heart of trust, really, right? Is the fact that there is also such a thing as emotional trust, right? And part of it, we go to psychological safety, right? We see emotional trust as being high in environments where there is high psychological safety. We trust you. I trust that I can be more open to you in terms of my emotions, in terms of my fears, in terms of my concerns, my ambitions, my dreams. Okay, my concerns even outside of work. Okay, of course, you will argue, well, Chippy, is that even necessary? We're in a workplace, we should be professional, supposedly. But we forget that human beings are not just purely rational, professional beings, right? We're also filled with emotions. And that's part of how we operate. And for us to dismiss emotions to the side and say, that's not professional, that's actually incorrect nowadays. I mean, that's something that you shouldn't be holding as a position right now. I mean, as human beings, we're both rational and emotional. It's not either or, right? I mean, you don't just treat the person emotionally only, but you also don't treat that person rationally only. I mean, it's both, and it's the skills required for each one that you need to be able to straddle both, right? So, but if you think about it, trust is a function of the knowledge of the person. Okay. And for us to be able to build these types of trust, the cognitive trust and the emotional trust, we have to know the person well, right? And vice versa. I mean, that person won't trust us if he or she will not know us that well, also. So, how do we actually gain knowledge of that person? Well, there are two ways, okay, of actually gaining knowledge of the person. There are two types of knowledges, okay, in that respect, okay. First is you want to build your direct knowledge about your team members. This means actual direct interaction, okay. You have to talk to the person. You have to really go out of your way and talk to a team member. You really have to go out of your way and participate in activities that involves your team. You really have to go out of your way and really find out individually your students. You have to go out of your way and really understanding who your clients are, who your stakeholders are, your partners are. You really go out of your way, okay, and gain that direct knowledge about these people, because that's the only way that you can actually build your trust, okay. And this is something that I'm sure some of those in the audience right now who are the extension partners of the department. I mean, one of our ways of actually building direct knowledge about you as our partners is we have to go out and actually go to you and really talk to you. And sometimes you don't have to talk to you about work, and we have to talk to you about everything else. How's everything? How's the health of your family? How's the health of the people around you? Okay, what are the current concerns? That's the way for us to build direct knowledge about everyone. And that's how we actually increase our trust. Okay. Now, the second type of knowledge, which is reflected knowledge, and this is a little bit peculiar because reflected knowledge is knowledge of about ourselves coming from other people, right? So this is about self-knowledge, but it's reflected through other people. Okay. And we have to develop our empathy by knowing how other people see us, or at least based on our own observation. Perhaps their impression of us isn't exactly correct, but if that's what we observe from them, then we have to be sensitive that, okay, this is how the others are looking at me right now. Okay. And that's important because that knowledge will now dictate how I should be dealing with them. Okay. That knowledge is reflected knowledge. Okay. And there's a lot of literature about reflected knowledge and direct knowledge in psychology, okay? And how these types of knowledge actually help in building your organizations. Okay, but bottom line is, if you really want to increase your trust, okay, you have to know the person really well, and there are two ways for us to know people well. Okay, it's through direct knowledge and reflected knowledge. Now let's go to our last topic, okay, for us to be able to succeed well in remote work and virtual teams is using the right tools, using the right digital tools. And probably I'll spend at length discussing these things, okay? But uh, right now, I'm not going to talk about the what. I'm not going to talk about the tools per se, but I'm going to talk about the how, okay, the practice or the exercise of these tools. So really, it doesn't matter what the tools are; it's how you use them, right? And there's this favorite saying that I've been saying over many many years, and I've heard this in the context of project management, but it's quite apt to mention it here. Like, remember that a fool with a tool is still a fool, right? So it's not about the tool; it's how you use the tool. That's going to be important, and we'll see that in a while. Well, first of all, with the pandemic, this reality of tech exhaustion exists. People are getting tired. We've heard about Zoom fatigue, okay, Zoom burnout. We get that. It's real, right? And the reason why tech exhaustion exists is because, well, as some psychologists have discovered, there is no break in between that is non-digital or non-technological in nature. Unlike, for example, if we go to a class, we go to the classroom. If we go to move to our next class, there is that small break in between. And what would that be? Well, us moving out of the room, walking towards the next room. Okay. It might be short. Okay. Or it might be you don't even have to go out of that room. Maybe you'll have to ask the people, wait for the students to leave the room. That allows you a little bit of break to recoup, to recalibrate yourself. Okay. And that allows us to be able to drag on and on and on, okay, for many hours, even for those of us teaching, without feeling that tired, because there are breaks in between. We probably don't realize it. In the case of the remote work setup right now, we don't really have those cues. Okay. Sometimes we find ourselves moving from one meeting to another. Okay. Immediately moving from one meeting to another. And there's not much time for us to take a little bit of a break. Sometimes we're also tempted to double book, right? I mean, we sort of attend two meetings at the same time, but I don't think we're actually listening to either one, right? So our effectiveness for both is severely diminished. But the reality there is that just because we think the technology has made these things accessible, it makes us prone to exhaustion. It makes us prone to burnout. And more than burnout, this is one of the more popular articles last year, the idea of grief. Okay, what we're feeling right now is not fatigue, it's actually grief. It's grief because we're unable to actually recoup ourselves. We sort of missing or feeling that we've already lost the good old days, so to speak. That's what we're feeling as well. I mean, more than the burnout, we're also feeling grief. So how do we combat this tech exhaustion? Okay, and what are the things that we have to watch out when we're dealing with digital tools in the context of remote work? Well, first of all, there is such a thing as a mutual knowledge problem. Now, that's a risk. What do we mean by mutual knowledge problem? Let's say we have an object in mind. Let's say X, okay, or an orange or an apple. Okay. Uh, I mean, I would know that what's in front of me is an apple. The person beside me would know, okay, that's an apple. But mutual knowledge is me knowing that the other person knows that that's an apple, that person knowing that I know that that's an apple. And we know that we know when we know. Or it goes on and on and on recursively, right? But the point of mutual knowledge is that we know what the other person is knowing, or may perhaps we think they know what we know. Okay, so it can get really convoluted. But the bottom line there is that sometimes we can be wrong in that assumption. We might think the other person knows, but probably he or she doesn't. Okay, or maybe he or she thinks we know, but we don't. So the bottom line here is that this becomes a problem, and this is known as a mutual knowledge problem. And one way to solve that is really making sure that we understand the context very well and being explicit about it, really speaking. Okay, sometimes we say na, okay, let's meet later. Okay, maybe for back in the old days when you say meet later, when we have some idea on what later means. But others might forget what that later means. What do you mean by later? Is that 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 3:30? Is it tomorrow? I mean, that's also later. Is it next week? So it's important that we become specific. We also understand, and we have to uh, take pains to really explain ourselves. Sometimes in emails, we're so tempted to write very short emails, thinking that the other person know what we mean. But no, I mean, even if we think we know, if even if we think we know what they mean, it never hurts to actually write it down again, put the context, okay? And that's one way to resolve disagreements, misunderstandings, because we've established that context properly, okay? And all of us are actually doing it. So we avoid the mutual knowledge problem. Technology can help us do that. We make sure that, it there's that risk because of, and we see that in chat apps, right? Because it allows us to see the histories. Sometimes we think that that person can just scroll up, no, and look at the history, but never hurts to really repeat yourself once in a while. Okay, so just to establish the context. Now, another problem is the social presence problem. No? Unlike in a physical setup, you know that the person is there, but sometimes it happens that the person's mind is floating elsewhere, right? But you know the person is there. In a remote setup, that's even compounded, right? You're not even sure whether that person is there. You don't see the person on cam. The person is muted, but you see an icon. You see the profile picture there. So is the person really there? Okay, and that's difficult. In fact, it's also a challenge. Even right now, as I speak in front of you, I mean, some of you would be listening to me. Some of you might be seeing the slide. Okay, that's good. But for me, I have no immediate cues right now. I don't get to see everyone right now. I don't get to see your faces. I don't have an immediate cue telling me who's there, that they're actually there. So it builds that social presence problem. And one way to actually resolve the social presence problem is taking into consideration two important aspects of presence. Okay, intimacy and immediacy, right? Intimacy is, that deepness of feeling towards the other person. This is a feeling thing. Okay, you're intimate with another person because you really get to connect with that person very well. Okay, the connection is deep. Okay, and there's this positive cycle that the person on the other side reciprocates. Okay, so intimacy is established. Immediacy, on the other hand, is the feedback is immediate. It's real time, so to speak. Okay, and that's one way to establish presence. One way to establish presence is to make sure that you're immediate, real time. Okay, you get immediate feedback, right? Immediate. Okay, nothing in between. Okay, and you're able to go deep. You're being genuinely concerned. Okay, and we talked about earlier about building trust, about empathy. That's part of it. That's part of building intimacy. That you're really concerned about the feelings of the other person, which is not something that is immediately available to us with the tools, right? Yeah, we can click on the react button, or we can heart, or do a thumbs up, or do an angry emoji, but that's a very pale reflection of what we're feeling right now. So the other person doesn't really have a good picture of what we're feeling right now. And one way to us to build intimacy is to really get to know the other person very well in terms of their feelings by really going out and finding out, and even asking directly, okay, and engaging in genuine conversations about it. Okay. Now, another challenge that I'm sure you guys are well familiar with is moving from lean media to rich media. Lean media, text is a lean media. Okay, so documents belong to lean media. Rich media would be videos. Okay, interactivity. I mean, you're people in a video conference. Okay, that's rich media. So one of the challenges right now with remote work is that back in the pre-pandemic days, it's all just enough for us to pass around papers, right? Documents, and we're there. We're in a meeting. Okay, so the available media to us is lean. It's just a document. But now with remote work, the media has increased its richness. Okay, so now we have video, we have audio, we can do recordings now, we can do playbacks. Okay, we can do simultaneous sentiment analysis, people reacting to certain comments in the chat. Okay, I mean, we see that. Now, the thing there is that when we consider lean media and rich media, we also want to look at it based on its immediacy, whether it is synchronous or asynchronous. Now, This is a busy slide, and then the later slide is even busier. But you have to understand that depending on your intention, okay, you can use lean, you can use rich. We're not saying that rich media is much better now for remote work. That may not be effective. In fact, you can hasten the problem of tech exhaustion if you use rich media. So in this matrix, okay, depending on your synchronous and asynchronous intent, okay, do you want everybody to have immediate feedback right away? Okay, then use a synchronous line. What would you use? Would you use a rich media platform or a lean media platform? Okay. So these are some of the examples. We won't go through them one by one. Okay. Now this slide is even busier, right? I mean, uh, uh, the rows, okay, the leftmost column would tell you the different types of media that's available for us in remote work. And the top row would be the different dimensions that we'd consider this media. You can see it's quite varied, right? Some media would have high delivery but have low fine tune potential. Fine tune meaning you can't really retract your statement. If you said something in jest and it offended someone, well, you can't retract that anymore. You've already said it. So fine tuning is no longer possible. Unlike, let's say, perhaps in a shared folder system, okay, the fine tune is high because you can still edit it out, you know. You can even perhaps turn off the version history. That's fine. You won't incriminate yourself. But, you know, in terms of the delivery speed, you know, you'll have to wait for people to tune in, you know, and put in their inputs. So that cannot be, that can be a bit slower than a face-to-face meeting. Okay, this is quite varied, right? It's very colorful. But the point here at this period in our brand, but the point here right now is making sure that we decide based on our relationship with the team members, the existing relationship with the team members, and the communication goal. What is it that I want to do right now as far as communication is concerned? Okay. And sometimes you might be thinking that we might be so fixated with just one method. Face to face, that's it. We're happy with face to face. We like it. But we're close to the idea of the advantages of the other methods that's available to us. Okay. So we realized that, hey, in our current situation right now, it's possible for us to use other techniques, other methods. The bigger challenge is understanding our relationship with that person or with the persons involved in that team, in that collective, and the goal, the intention. What do we intend to achieve in this particular meeting, in this particular communication method? What's the goal? That's the more important thing. Okay. Now, another challenge that we have, and I don't say this in a bad way. In fact, you'll be surprised. Is we need to have more redundant communication. Yeah, it's a little bit funny because some people are thinking that redundant communication. No, that's a waste. That's an excess. We're not being efficient if we have redundant communication. Well, let me tell you something. Do you think that in a lecture, when you listen to a lecture, you just sit down and listen to the lecture, that you will absorb 100% of the lecture? No. That's why you take down notes. Okay. That's another form of redundant communication. Notes. Okay. Even if the content is the same, how it was delivered to you, okay, varies, but the content is the same. Okay. The number of instances of that same content has been delivered to you is numerous, is not singular. So the idea here is being strategic with our over communication. Especially if we want to impose changes, it's important that we over communicate. That's always the rule. We know this in basic management, so to speak. Over communication is much, much better than under communication. Because under communication leads to misunderstandings, which would lead to more fixing eventually, which would be more costly, as opposed to the incremental addition to costs due to over communication. Yeah, you do the analysis, it's much cheaper for you to over communicate than to straddle the risks of under communication. But being strategic in our over communication also means that a tip here is that we work with asynchronous first, send out an email, circulate a memo, and then later on we meet everybody in a real time environment, face-to-face meeting perhaps, or video conference, for a synchronous session to talk about the same topic. And that reinforces the content better. So that's one way to do strategic over communication. So we do the asynchronous first and then we go synchronous. Uh, Now, another aspect that we find ourselves in is cultural differences. Sometimes uh, a simple text might be received by one person well, but the other person would think that you're attacking that person, right? That other person. So we have to be sensitive with cultural differences, even if we're not dealing with non-Filipinos. Or, I mean, sorry, even if we are, yeah, even if we're not dealing with non-Filipinos, meaning we're just dealing with one another as Filipinos, okay, coming from the same country or from the same nationality, there could be some microcultures that are different from one another. We have to be sensitive to that, okay? We see that also in perhaps new employees coming from different organizations, so they really struggle at the start. So you can imagine in a pre-pandemic situation, a new hire would already struggle to absorb the culture, all the more now. With the remote work setup, there's really no way for that new hire to really absorb the culture very well. And yet cultural differences exist. Okay, they exist. I mean, they don't go away just because you've gone to remote work. That's already dismissed. But with all the talks about cultural differences and all of these literatures about diversity, equity, and inclusion, okay, this is particularly true in the U.S. Okay, uh, for all of that, the most basic tip here to address cultural differences is we make use of these tools to ask questions. Don't forget to ask. I mean, if you feel that somebody may have been offended with what you said, well, nothing wrong in asking, sorry, I don't know if you felt offended by that. This was my intention. I didn't mean to offend you. Okay, but were you offended by that? The other person. I mean, don't play hard to get, right? I mean, don't play bahala ka. No, I mean, try to also understand that. Okay, yeah. This is how I felt. Okay, when I read your message, other people might take it the wrong way, and that's good for us. Okay, and that's the risk when we use digital tools right now. The ability to detect these nuanced differences in terms of culture, in terms of behavior. We don't get that with digital tools. Okay, even if you have video and all that, well, body language is not enough. Okay, the visual cues aren't really enough. So there's that limiting factor right now when it comes to remote work. Okay, so the bottom line here is that we want to use social tools because we want to close social distances. Okay, talking about empathy, talking about making sure that nobody is professionally isolated. Now we use these tools to actually bridge people together. Okay, it's quite ironic that we see how these tools can be weaponized. Okay, to create divisions. Well, that shouldn't be the case. So, and we should be very very careful when we use these tools. And the intention of these tools is to really close down social distances, making sure that we're more united in that respect. So I mean, just to recap, and then we'll go through the questions later. So these are the three things that we've talked about today. Alignment, making sure that when we're starting remote work, when we're continuing with remote work, we have to launch and relaunch frequently. In remote work, ensure that building trust is a priority in your organization. Okay. It might seem touchy-feely, it might seem quote unquote unprofessional, but as I've said earlier, we're human beings. We're also composed of emotions and intelligence. So it's important for us to actually build that trust. And we spend time building trust with one another. Be creative about it. And lastly, I mean, it's not about the what in terms of the tools, it's how we use them. And we have to make sure that we're also sensitive in using these tools excessively, because on the excess side, you have exhaustion, burnout, grief. On the defect side, if we don't use these tools as well, you risk alienation, marginalization, isolation from one another. And with that, I'd like to turn the ball back to our hosts, and I'd be happy to answer your questions now.
Wow, thank you for that informational presentation, Mr. Buenafe. This talk definitely motivated me to balance my work and how to be a team player when working with other people. Although I believe I'm not the only one who has some questions that hope to be addressed, therefore we shall now proceed to our Q&A. Well, according to our question and answer tab, I seem to have two questions waiting to be answered. For the first question, how do you think one can give feedback without attacking the psychological safety?
Okay, feedback without attacking psychological safety. Um, one thing that's being taught in feedback literature is feedback is not about the person, right? Feedback should be about what the person did or did not do. So if the feedback is focused on the action rather than the character, then psychological safety is maintained. Why? Because the point of psychological safety is you want to learn from your mistakes, right? So don't point out that the person is bad. Point out what the person actually did. Okay. So, and that ensures psychological safety. Sometimes when we were growing up, and we see that in our own experiences of parenting, sometimes we hear our parents say, ano ka ba naman? Sama-sama mo naman. Diba? Or ano ka ba naman? Ganito, ang tamad mo naman. Diba? You see those feedback comments, right? They attack the character of the person, but they don't really give you anything actionable, right? Why is it that you're masama? What made you bad? So how do you change, right? And that promotes what Carol Dweck, okay, for those of you who've known her on the fixed mindset, okay, and the growth mindset. So she made this book Mindset, okay. She talks about fixed and growth mindset. The fixed mindset people focus on the person. So as they're growing up, the feedback is about the person. But the people who've grown up to have a growth mindset, the feedback was about the person's actions, what they did or did not do. Okay, so that's one very clear way on we can establish very good psychological safety through feedback by making sure that the feedback that we give to the other person is not about the person, but about what the person did or did not do. And of course, in relation to that, it has to be something that was observed. It's not something that was inferred, right? Or we just thought of. So it has to be observable because if it's observed, it's empirical, there's no contest there. That person will not even disagree with you because that was observed, right? But if it is something that is concluded or inferred from, which normally is an inference of character, then okay, that's going to erode psychological safety.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Buenafe. I'll always remember that every time I'm going to do some peer evaluations. So, for our second question, are there any ways in which dynamic and real time social interactions in the office environment can be reproduced in remote work scenarios?
Okay. There are creative ways, right? Uh, in some respects, there are techniques known as substitution techniques, right? Wherein what has been done in a real life situation is perhaps replicated in a remote work situation. So, for example, water cooler conversations. So, one way to actually do that in a remote work scenario is, sometimes we organize a call. Okay, let's meet together after lunch. Let's have a virtual coffee or something to that effect. Well, that's one way to do that. Okay. Would it be effective? Would it give the same dynamic as to improve rapport and trust with one another? Oh, that's a 50-50 question. Um, there's no definite answer, perhaps. It can be counterproductive in some cases. Okay, but to answer that question, yes, there are ways, um, and there are tools that can help support that. We've seen a lot of tools. For example, in the case of workshops or team building situations. Well, let's say workshops wherein you're involved in getting the inputs of many people. Okay, um, yeah, you can have the dynamic real time social interactions with some of the tools available to you, um, like Mentimeter or your Jamboard. I mean, for Google, that's also one thing that we've looked into. Okay, even in Zoom, there are additional features that can be done in Zoom that would actually promote such interactions, but they're not going to be the same as how it was before, right? And the reason being is that In physical face-to-face interactions, real-time social interactions, as the question has said, there are so many little things that's not immediately discernible by digital technology, right? Like being able to understand, let's say, the how a person looks at us. Sometimes there's that mutual knowledge already in what that means, because that was built over time. That rapport was built over time. But in technology, that technology can capture that. Right? Maybe you can look into the artificial intelligence on how much the pupil dilated and how the duration of the dilation and all of these things. You can find out, or you can probably make an inference based on you know some network analysis and saying, okay, this person is being crafty, etc., etc. Okay, that might be possible technologically, but it's not really there yet. It's not yet perfected yet. So the answer is yes, but it's not going to be as the same as it was before.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Buenafe. And it appears we have a follow-up question from our question and answer tab. How about confronting your superior on his or her mistake? Is it okay?
This is a pretty in a way, this is a pretty rich question, right? It has many layers, it has many textures, right? Um, I would want to say in the context of remote work setups, okay, how do you do that? How do you confront or how do you give feedback to your superior about his or her mistake? Okay. Well, first of all, was it a mistake? Is there an objective basis to say that that was a mistake, right? Or was that your interpretation of an action by the superior? You have to answer that question first. Because if it is objectively clear, then it's just easy to give a feedback because it's objective, right? Objective based on written rules, based on what was observed and the reaction of other people. I think the ethical evaluation is clear in that respect. Okay? If it's an objective mistake, it is something that's observed, then you just have to see it for what it is. You're not going to conclude that you're a bad superior, you're a bad boss. Okay. Um, but if it is an interpretation of a mistake, it's an interpretation that he or she did a mistake. Okay, that's a little bit more nuanced. What you should be telling that person is what you've observed and the impact of what you've observed to you. Okay. Now, whether that is a mistake or not in general, that is up for the world to decide, maybe. But it's important that you are able to communicate that with your superior because there is impact to the action that was done. Okay. Maybe the same action done to a different person would have a different impact. Okay. That's possible. But yeah, forget about that. I mean, if that impact to you was negative, that person should know that, be it a superior or a peer or even somebody under you, especially. But again, same principle. Don't attack the person saying that no, you're a bad person. You're so insensitive. You didn't know what I feel. Well, no, 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 no. I mean, you start off by saying that, okay, this is what I've observed. Okay. You mentioned XYZ, and this is what I felt, or this is what happened. Okay. And then you can come up with all this. And it makes it more complicated in the case of remote work setups because it is so difficult for us to really evaluate the action per se and the impact because the impact can be diminished, can be muted at some time. So our assessment also of the impact is not perfect. But regardless, I mean, if you structure the conversation of your feedback such that you focus on the action and the impact, and you mention that to a superior, to anybody else, and being explicit about it, of course, being careful, as we said about mutual knowledge, right? You be explicit about it, then it becomes the problem of your superior if he or she accepts it or not. As long as you've said it in that structure, then you're on safe ground.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Benefe. Mr. Benefe, this is an awesome and well-informative Q&A session. I do hope we all remember the things we needed to do whenever we are working with other people. But before we officially close the program, I would like to call on Mr. Romel Teocaris to give his closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Sir Chippy, for your awesome presentation today. I hope everybody enjoys today's brown bag. Thank you very much for attending, and I'll be presenting the next brown bag on June. Stay tuned and watch out, everyone. Thank you very much, and have a nice day today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that heartwarming speech, Mr. Romel. As we end today's webinar, we would like to thank our speaker, Mr. Buenafe, and all the other participants who joined us today. We wish everyone to stay safe and have a good day.